There's a room inside the Library of Congress that almost nobody talks about. Not because it is hidden, not because it is classified, but because most people would rather believe it never existed at all. Inside that room are records of books that were once hunted across America like criminals. Books seized from homes, books pulled from classrooms, books taken from doctors, teachers, artists, and ordinary citizens who believed they had the right to read whatever they wanted. Some of those books still survive. Others disappeared forever. Not lost accidentally, not destroyed in some random fire, deliberately erased, burned, shredded, melted down into pulp by people who believed certain ideas were too dangerous for the public to touch. And the strangest part is this: the man responsible for much of it wasn't a dictator. He wasn't a king. He wasn't even elected. He was a former dry goods clerk named Anthony Comstock. And for more than 40 years, one man helped decide what America was allowed to read. In 1873, the United States was exhausted. Political scandals filled newspapers, railroad corruption had infected Congress, the economy was collapsing under speculation and fraud, public trust was evaporating. Americans wanted someone to blame. That is usually when censorship becomes most powerful, because censorship rarely arrives wearing chains. It arrives carrying promises, protection, morality, safety, stability. And Anthony Comstock understood that better than almost anyone alive. He walked into Washington carrying boxes filled with materials he called obscene. Cheap novels, erotic photographs, contraceptive pamphlets, medical diagrams, playing cards, French art prints. He laid them out in front of lawmakers like evidence from a crime scene. Politicians who had spent months defending themselves from corruption accusations suddenly found an opportunity. Supporting a moral crusade was easier than explaining financial scandals. Voting for censorship made them appear righteous. So Congress moved fast, almost unbelievably fast. On March 3, 1873, lawmakers passed what became known as the Comstock Act. Debate lasted less than an hour. The law gave the federal government power to ban obscene materials from the mail system. There was only one problem. The law never clearly defined what obscene meant. That detail changed everything. Because once a law depends on interpretation, power moves to whoever controls the interpretation. 3 days later, Anthony Comstock received a federal badge from the United States Post Office. He gained police authority, arrest powers, and unrestricted travel access through the mail system. At 28 years old, he became something America had never really seen before: a national censor. And almost immediately, the definition of obscenity began expanding. At first, many Americans supported him. Most people assumed the law targeted pornography or scams exploiting vulnerable people. That sounded reasonable. But the boundaries moved quickly. Medical textbooks were seized because they described human anatomy too directly. Pamphlets explaining birth control were confiscated. Scientific papers discussing reproduction were banned. Art dealers were arrested for selling paintings containing nudity. Publishers distributing translations of ancient Greek and Roman literature suddenly found themselves under investigation. The same government that celebrated classical civilization now treated parts of it like contraband. Homer, Ovid, Boccaccio. Books taught in elite universities became dangerous when ordinary people tried to access them freely. And once censorship machinery exists, it rarely stays limited to morality. Soon political ideas became targets too. Socialist newspapers disappeared from circulation. Labor organizing pamphlets were seized. Anarchist writings vanished from bookstores. Criticism of powerful institutions slowly became harder to distribute safely through the mail. America had created a system where ideas themselves could be treated like criminal evidence. But what made the system truly dangerous was not just the law. It was the business model behind it. Most people never learn this part. The New York Society for the Suppression of Vice was not simply a government office. It was a private organization with extraordinary legal powers. Its agents could search property, seize materials, and make arrests. And the organization received a percentage of the fines collected from successful prosecutions. Think about that for a second. The more people they convicted, the more money they earned. Every burned book became revenue. Every raid strengthened the institution financially. It created a system where censorship rewarded itself. And wealthy industrialists funded it enthusiastically. Bankers, publishers, corporate elites. Some of the richest men in America backed Comstock's operations because controlling information has always been valuable to powerful people. A population that cannot freely exchange ideas becomes easier to manage. That pattern repeats constantly through history. Control the printing press. Control the schools. Control the vocabulary. Eventually, you control what people are even capable of imagining. And Comstock understood the importance of fear. Fear does most of censorship's work long before arrests happen. Once enough examples are made publicly, people begin censoring themselves. Teachers stop assigning controversial material. Publishers reject risky manuscripts. Writers avoid certain topics entirely. Doctors become careful about what medical advice they mail to patients. Nobody has to ban every book individually because fear convinces society to cooperate voluntarily. That was the real genius of the system. The uncertainty. Nobody knew exactly where the line was because the line kept moving. And when people cannot predict punishment, they become cautious about everything. One publisher who refused to cooperate was a freethinker named D.M. Bennett. Bennett believed ideas should compete openly instead of being filtered through government morality. He published a newspaper called The Truth Seeker, dedicated to science, free thought, skepticism, and intellectual freedom. To Comstock, that made him dangerous. Not because Bennett promoted violence, because he encouraged independent thinking. His readers included famous lawyers, writers, and reformers. His publication grew rapidly across America, reaching thousands of households through the mail, which meant Comstock saw him as a threat that needed to be stopped. In 1877, federal authorities arrested Bennett for distributing materials considered immoral under the Comstock Act. But the charges were bizarre. One involved a scientific tract. Another involved criticism of religion. The government's own arrest records described Bennett not simply as a publisher, but as an infidel. That word mattered, because the campaign was never only about obscenity, it was about controlling acceptable belief. At one point, Comstock used a fake identity to request certain pamphlets directly from Bennett through the mail. When Bennett complied, authorities arrested him immediately. Today, most people would call that entrapment. Back then, the courts barely questioned it. And something else kept happening repeatedly during these trials. Jurors often never saw the actual materials being prosecuted. Comstock would claim the contents were too offensive to display publicly. Judges frequently accepted his judgment without requiring evidence to be fully examined in court. Imagine being convicted for distributing something the jury was not even allowed to read. That happened over and over again. The accusation itself became enough. Meanwhile, hypocrisy surrounded the entire system. Some of the same wealthy figures funding censorship operations privately distributed materials remarkably similar to the ones getting ordinary people arrested. Birth control advertisements circulated quietly among elites, while public discussions about contraception remained criminalized for everyone else. Access to knowledge became class-based. The wealthy always seemed to preserve freedoms they deny to others. Bennett eventually went to prison. Hundreds of thousands of Americans protested his sentence. Petitions flooded government offices demanding reform. Supporters argued that freedom of the press meant nothing if unpopular ideas could simply be labeled immoral and removed. But the system held. Because by then, censorship had become institutional. It employed people, generated revenue, created political leverage, and most importantly, it convinced millions of Americans that restricting dangerous information was necessary for public safety. That phrase never disappears from history. Public safety. Every era invents new reasons certain ideas must be controlled. The language changes. The mechanism stays familiar. And while Bennett sat in prison, another terrifying realization slowly spread among writers and educators across America. The government did not need to ban every book individually. It only needed to make examples out of enough people, because fear would finish the job. By the late 19th century, publishers had started quietly avoiding controversial subjects before authorities ever intervened. Self-censorship became normal. And that may be the most effective form of censorship ever created. Not forced silence, chosen silence. The kind people impose on themselves because survival feels more important than truth. And then, the book burnings intensified. Not symbolic burnings, industrial destruction. Entire printing plates were confiscated and melted down, which meant books could no longer be reproduced at all. That detail matters more than most people realize. Destroying a single book removes one copy. Destroying the printing plates erases the possibility of future copies. It is the difference between censorship and historical deletion. And by the early 1900s, thousands of texts had vanished into that darkness. Some were obscene, some were scientific, some were political. Some simply questioned authority too openly. But once destruction begins, distinctions stop mattering, because censorship systems always expand beyond their original justification. Always. And America was about to discover just how far that expansion could go. By the beginning of the 20th century, Anthony Comstock had become one of the most feared men in American publishing. Writers whispered his name like a warning. Printers avoided certain topics entirely just to stay safe. Booksellers quietly removed controversial titles from shelves before inspectors could arrive, and ordinary Americans learned an uncomfortable lesson. Freedom of speech means very little if people are too afraid to use it. But the deeper story was never just about books. It was about control over knowledge itself. Because once authorities gain power to decide which ideas are dangerous, almost anything can become a threat. Medicine, science, economics, religion, politics, history, even simple curiosity. And perhaps no case revealed that danger more clearly than the story of Ida Craddock. Today, almost nobody remembers her name, but in the late 1800s, she became one of the most controversial women in America. Craddock was not a criminal mindmeister. She was not operating underground networks or violent movements. She wrote educational material about marriage, intimacy, and relationships. Several physicians actually supported her work because they believed honest information improved family life. But Anthony Comstock viewed her publications as moral poison. For years, federal agents targeted her repeatedly. Her books were seized, her mail was monitored, her writing was treated like contraband. Finally, in 1902, she was convicted for mailing a pamphlet called The Wedding Night. Most jurors never fully read it. That detail sounds impossible today, but it happened constantly during Comstock-era prosecutions. Authorities often argued that displaying the material in court would corrupt the courtroom itself. So juries convicted people based largely on descriptions provided by prosecutors. Imagine being judged for words others are forbidden to examine themselves. Craddock faced years in federal prison. She was 45 years old. and she knew exactly what prison conditions looked like during that period in American history. The night before sentencing, she took her own life. Before dying, she left public letters accusing Comstock of violating freedom of thought, freedom of religion, and freedom of the press. Newspapers across America covered the tragedy, and for the first time, many Americans began questioning whether the nation's moral crusade had transformed into something darker. Because once censorship starts destroying lives publicly, the human cost becomes impossible to ignore. But even then, the machinery continued operating. Another target was Elma Drake Slenker, a grandmother and Quaker writer who mailed private letters discussing marriage and intimacy. Her personal correspondence became evidence after a railroad accident burst open mailbags and exposed sealed letters to postal workers. Think about how terrifying that precedent was. Private mail could suddenly become criminal evidence if authorities disliked the content. Slenker refused to apologize. Even while jailed, she continued defending intellectual freedom and privacy rights. Thousands of supporters sent letters demanding her release. Yet the system kept moving forward because by then, censorship had become culturally normalized. That is the part history books often fail to explain properly. The most powerful censorship systems are not maintained only through force. They survive because large parts of society begin accepting them emotionally. People convince themselves restrictions are necessary, temporary, protective, moral. And once enough citizens believe dangerous ideas must be controlled, censorship no longer feels oppressive. It feels responsible. That transformation is where democracies become vulnerable, because unlike dictatorships, democratic censorship often arrives through public approval. The public asks for protection first. Then institutions grow around providing it, and those institutions rarely surrender power voluntarily afterward. By the time Americans started recognizing how expansive the Comstock system had become, it had already reshaped generations of intellectual life. Publishers learned caution. Teachers learned caution. Doctors learned caution. Artists learned caution. Even scientists became careful about which subjects they discussed publicly. Fear altered the boundaries of acceptable conversation. And perhaps the most disturbing detail of all involved not the books themselves, but the destruction of printing technology. Comstock proudly documented the destruction of printing plates used to reproduce banned works. Hundreds of thousands of pounds of plates were reportedly melted down during his career. That meant entire categories of writing could disappear permanently. No reprints, no future editions, no rediscovery. Gone. Modern audiences sometimes assume censorship only delays information temporarily. But in the 19th century, destroying reproduction equipment could erase works almost completely from historical memory. Some titles known from Comstock's records no longer exist anywhere. Only their names survive inside government ledgers. Think about that. Books destroyed so completely that humanity remembers only the titles listed by the man who erased them. The censor's archive outlived the authors. And there is something deeply unsettling about that reality. Because history is not shaped only by what survives. It is shaped by what disappears. Every missing book changes the intellectual landscape slightly. Every erased argument alters future conversations. Every silenced writer creates invisible gaps nobody notices because future generations never realize what was removed. Most censorship damage happens silently, not through dramatic raids or public trials, through absence. Ideas that never circulate, questions people never learn to ask, subjects society slowly forgets how to discuss openly. And around the same period, American education itself began changing. Economic history became less detailed in schools. Debates about banking systems, industrial monopolies, and monetary policy gradually faded from public understanding. Complex political discussions narrowed into simplified narratives easier to manage and easier to teach. Some historians argue these developments were unrelated to censorship laws. Maybe they were, but the timing remains difficult to ignore. A society trained to avoid controversial intellectual exploration becomes easier to direct politically. Once people lose the vocabulary necessary to question institutions, challenging those institutions becomes almost impossible. And that pattern extends far beyond the 19th century. Every generation believes censorship belongs to the past, until it returns under new language, different technology, different politics, different fears, but the same fundamental logic. Certain information is dangerous. Certain ideas are harmful. Certain questions should not circulate freely. The justification changes constantly. The mechanism barely changes at all. What makes the Comstock story especially disturbing is that the law itself never truly disappeared. Many Americans assume it was repealed long ago. It wasn't. Parts of it were weakened by court rulings, certain restrictions were removed, but the legal structure survived. Even in modern America, portions of the Comstock Act still exist inside federal law. And recently, courts have referenced it again in debates involving medical access and government authority, which means the architecture built in 1873 never fully vanished. It simply became dormant, waiting. That is why historians continue revisiting this period so intensely, because the story is not really about Victorian morality. It is about something much larger. Who controls access to knowledge? Who decides which ideas are dangerous? Who benefits when information disappears? And perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all, how many books vanished without anyone important defending them? Not famous books, not classics, ordinary books, independent newspapers, small-run pamphlets, scientific debates, political arguments, personal testimonies, entire worlds of thought erased before future generations even knew they existed. History remembers the surviving masterpieces, but censorship often destroys the fragile works first. The obscure voices, the inconvenient voices, the experimental voices, the ones without wealthy defenders. And when those disappear, society loses more than paper. It loses possibilities. Today, inside the Library of Congress, researchers can still request access to the old arrest records and seizure ledgers from Comstock's operations. Page after page documents confiscated titles, destroyed materials, arrests, and prosecutions. Cold handwriting, meticulous records. Evidence of an era when one man helped shape the boundaries of acceptable thought for an entire nation. And somewhere among those pages are titles no living person can read anymore. Books destroyed so thoroughly that only the censor's notes remain behind. That may be the darkest irony in the entire story. The records of destruction survived more completely than the ideas that were destroyed. And maybe that is the real warning buried inside this forgotten chapter of American history. Censorship rarely announces itself as censorship. It calls itself protection, morality, responsibility, public safety. Until one day, people realize entire libraries have disappeared while everyone was busy arguing about whether the burning was justified. And by then, the missing books are already gone.